Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our uh, monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, a neighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you. Well, today we're going to have a fascinating conversation with a returning guest. We talked to him several years ago, and he's always wrestling the big foundational questions about reality and where we are. So I thought it would be a pleasure to have him back on. Jordan Hall, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Yeah, the origin story of this conversation. You and I haven't spoken in quite some time. It's
Yeah,
been years. I don't even remember how many years. Maybe
yeah,
3, 4, 5, something like that.
yeah.
But I got somebody showed me a video of Yuval Harari talking about something. We'll dig into it in a bit. I think you're going to show the clip, yeah?
Yeah, yes.
And I just happened to I'm a little bit fed up with the state of the art of the quality of thinking that is at the center of things like Davos Man
Right.
and the individuals who are in positions of authority in what I call the Blue Church several years back, who, for better or worse, have both authority and responsibility to steward the world that we live in. And this particular clip just kind of brought up a few pieces that annoyed me. So I tweeted about it. And I guess you must have seen that tweet because you then wrote me a message saying, hey, let's chat about it. And as it turns out, that particular video has gone, or the critique of that video has gone somewhat viral. Not my
Right.
critique, the critique in general. It's spread broadly. And this is nice because it implies that there's a certain moment where, sort of, in spite of its significant downsides, social media, in this case, largely Twitter, may be giving us an ability to perceive a problem, which is to say a limited quality of thinking that is having disproportionate influence over the world, but also a moment for us to collectively say, hey, hold on now. Let's think more deeply and properly about these kinds of questions. Like, it's actually important.
Yes. That's what I think. You said the midwits, if the midwits are running things, what are we going to, you're tired of it, right?
We're running amok, yes, and
Yeah, they're running
I'm running out of patience.
emphasis on amok. Okay, let's I want to share the screen real quick and then we'll pick up from there.
All right.
Many, maybe most legal systems are based on this idea, this belief in human rights. But human rights are just like heaven and like God. It's just a fictional story that we've invented and spread around. It may be a very nice story. It may be a very attractive story. We want to believe it. But it's just a story. It's not a reality. It is not a biological reality. Just as jellyfish and woodpeckers and ostriches have no rights, Homo sapiens have no rights also. Take a human, cut him open, look inside, you find their blood, and you find the heart and lungs and kidneys, but you don't find there any rights. The only place you find rights is in the fictional stories that humans have invented and spread around. And the same thing is also true in the political field. States and nations are also, like human rights and like God and like heaven, they too are just stories. A mountain is a reality. You can see it, you can touch it, you can even smell it. But Israel or the United States, they are just stories, very powerful stories, stories we might want to believe very much, but still they are just stories. You can't really see the United States. You cannot touch it. You cannot smell it.
So rights, these are not real. These are just abstractions, right? And they're not fundamental to humans, he's saying there.
Stories. and fictions.
Yeah, yeah.
And let's actually be a little bit precise. So we're going to, I think, spend a little bit of time teasing some things apart.
Sure.
So let me step up one level. This is actually largely representative of his thinking, the clip,
Right.
that piece you saw. You can go read his books. You can take a look at longer interviews. Obviously, a short clip can't cover the whole of an individual's metaphysics, their philosophy, their sort of deeper commitments, but it's not bad. More importantly, I think it's unfortunately representative of a particular frame that is present within the larger social field. In this case, I'm using the term Davos man, who have too much influence. And so I don't really concern myself with the way people think about things in general. Like, yes, great, think about things, write books about them. By all means, the more of that, the better. The problem is the degree to which certain ideas actually have significant influence, and that influence then is going to affect the world, particularly in a context where the world really needs to be stewarded well. And we can't coast.
Right.
Okay, so that's kind of the bigger picture. So let's take a look at teasing apart some of the propositions that he's putting forward. The first is it's broadly a very old-fashioned Enlightenment era distinction, the mind-body distinction. Right? So we're thinking about Descartes here. So he's making a distinction between something like what he calls biological reality.
Yeah.
And I assume he would also agree with the notion of physical reality.
Right.
Has to do with material, right? Material reality, things that you can sense with your hands, for example, things that you can see and touch and smell and taste. And then something else over here, which he refers to variously as just stories and fictions. Right? And that's a very old distinction. That's a distinction that we've been living with in the West now for 500 plus years. I should mention, by the way, that for a large portion of that period of time, those who agreed with that distinction but held that the story side of the distinction, or mind, was more fundamental, were actually more influential in Western culture. Right? So the idealists had significant influence up until the 1800s, late 1800s. And I should also mention that particular perspective, that philosophy, is making a bit of a comeback in the frame of what is known as simulationists. So these are guys who are on the far side of computer science, and they have come to the conclusion that the world that we believe, that we perceive, biological reality, as he talks about it, is in fact actually an illusion, a simulation, that we are living in a simulation. And the reason why I bring that up is that it is actually it's very difficult to demonstrate using the techniques of material science that's false.
Right.
That's the faculty by which we perceive biological reality, i.e. our mind, may very well be being deceived by some sort of intermediary that is presenting material facts. Right. So this is the great dichotomy that we've been dealing with since the split was first emerged. We have a mind. We certainly seem to have a mind, and nothing really makes sense if we don't have a mind. The thing that might think that it's being deluded into thinking it's a mind is something more than nothing, and that would be the mind, if that makes sense. A lot of words. And we also have a sense that there are phenomena out in the world that aren't, strictly speaking, the consequence of our mind. Right? We could call that the objective. And so we have these two worlds, the subjective and the objective, the mind, the body, that kind of thing. Right? So that's a distinction that's been made in the West a long time ago.
Yes.
Okay. Now, of course, in the context of that distinction, he seems to then be biasing largely in the direction of the materialists.
Right.
There's something about reality. He takes the notion of real and connects that to the notion of objective. So objective reality is somehow more real than things that live in this other category that he calls fictions and or stories. And notably, often he'll actually say just stories, which is important.
Right.
Now, just quickly, terms can be used to mean a lot of things. So I don't want to hang too much on this, but the term fiction is a unique kind of term. The word fiction implies something like particularly not real, like made up, fabricated. In some sense, even some of the etymology implies deceptively.
Right.
Not necessarily, but in that fashion. So when he says that the various kinds of stories, let's say human rights for the moment, are fictions, he's pulling away their connection to reality, putting them in a location that is distant from reality,
right.
And putting to the center objective empirical reality. Okay. Now we can branch multiple different ways from here, lots of different things to cover, and I'll try to cover all of it. or just a large portion of it. Let me think. Let me go with stories for a moment. So let's just double click on stories. And what I want to do is I want to take away the word just to just talk about stories. Because we can notice that when we look at the category of stories, there's a lot going on. Stories are different from each other. Stories are not all made of the same kind of material. They're not all equal. There are some stories that are more true than other stories, for example. And there's qualities of the truth of stories. Obviously, there are some stories that are more compelling, and we're going to ask a really big question around that in a moment, in relationship to what makes a story compelling, and are there ways of thinking about this notion of compelling that are more than just superficial marketing?
Right.
So let's say, for example, I want to compare the story of Scooby-Doo, The Lord of the Rings, Shakespeare's King Lear. No, let's go Shakespeare's Henry V, even better. The Song of Roland, and the biography of Patton. These are all stories. They're all very distinct from each other in their quality, each one of which has a different sense of its relationship with what we might call being real or have a reality to them. And for example, let's just use Lord of the Rings. If I were to make the assertion that Aragorn is a cave troll, anybody who's familiar with the corpus of Lord of the Rings would be able to tell me that that's wrong. There's a falsity to it, meaning that there's something about the nature of this story that has an internal integrity called continuity that governs our ability to be in relationship with. And this is the key point. There's a phenomenon in reality known as constraints. And by the way, constraints are enabling constraints and disabling constraints. An easy example might be if I'm swimming in a river, and it has a current, right, as most rivers do. If I want to swim downstream, the current is an enabling constraint.
Right.
It shapes my possibility in a way that has nothing to do with my particular will or desire. And it makes it easier. In this case, I'm swimming with the current. And of course, if I want to swim upstream, the current is a disabling constraint.
Sure.
So constraints are an aspect that we find throughout all the aspects of our lives. They're present in material reality, like rivers, but they're also present in this other category, stories. And I just mentioned there's a constraint to our capacity to make sense of the story of Lord of the Rings, where I can make an assertion and you can say, no, that's not true. And intersubjectively, I'm comparing this to empirical science, let's say 99, all reasonable, rational, honest readers of the Lord of the Rings can verify that what I said is in fact false. So there's an intersubjective verification of the truth or falsity of assertions about a particular corpus of a story. And by the way, I can even be more nuanced about it. I could, for example, we see this in Star Wars. Many Star Wars fans complain that the most recent, sequels violate the continuity of the story. Right? The essence or the sensibility of the characters, let's say Luke Skywalker, is somehow being broken, and that it's not the same story. It's breaking continuity. Right? Now, why is that a sense that we have?
Right.
What's going on here? Like, what's happening? We're dealing with this category of story, this category of fiction, but we're noticing that it actually has constraint built in. And that constraint has a reality that really governs a lot of our ability to be flexible and fluid with it. Okay.
Right.
So then let me jump out to this other question. I'm going to step up one piece. I don't want to go too high into philosophy. Let me just speak about the notion of truth. There was a conversation that happened a while back, around the time of our first call, where Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, I think for the first time, kind of met each other.
Yeah.
And they endeavored to puzzle through an epistemological challenge that they had. And as far as I could tell, never really got there well. And what I could say is that it's broadly based upon the fact that they weren't clear on the modality of truth, meaning that there are at least three distinct modes of truth. The first mode, which is the mode that I think Sam Harris and most Western rational scientist, materialist types assume is the whole of it, would be associative truth or empirical truth. And this is where the domain where we have, on the one hand, we have assertions, which, by the way, are stories or language. We have some mechanism of bridging those assertions to observables in this place that we call the objective, experiments, observations, etc. And then we have a notion that there are, in fact, observables that we're able to verify by means of an intersubjective, i.e., many different people agree with their observations. And then we can say, right, so if I were to say that there is a microphone in front of your face right now, that is an assertion of that kind. There's a set of words that mean something. There's an observable, a microphone. You and I both look at it and agree that it, in fact, the assertion is true.
Sure.
Yeah? And this kind of epistemology, this category is the epistemology that covers things like science and journalism. That's that kind of thing. And of course, it's very useful and functional. I don't want to critique that, but the point is that it's not the whole of it. The second category is a category that is very different in kind. It has very little to do with assertions and more to do with behaviors. It has more to do with things like, did the arrow fly true? Is the wall true? Is my friend true? Is he a true friend? Does that make sense? What this is something like well constructed or constituted in such a fashion that it is able to be fit to purpose and to navigate lived reality well, as we could call it lived truth. Now, what's interesting is that lived truth is actually more fundamental than associative truth for obvious reasons. Chimpanzees, for example, experience lived truth, but they don't experience associative truth meaningfully. A point that Harari makes earlier in that clip, actually. Now, the domain of lived truth, and this is a place where I lose most people because they don't, how do I say this? The culture wars of the last 500 years have made it very difficult for us to actually think clearly about these sorts of things. But religion is the discipline and the faculty that is most closely associated with lived truth, particularly among groups of people. Spirituality is more associated with lived truth in the context of a given individual. So this has to do with the way that we, as individuals and as groups of people, navigate our relationships with each other and our relationships with reality, and things like character. And by the way, wisdom. So we might say, for example, that intelligence is a very good faculty that's associated with associative truth. And wisdom is a faculty that's more deeply associated with lived truth.
Yeah.
And, right, that distinction is important. By the way, the third mode of truth we could call mystery or transcendent truth. And there's a lot we can talk about there, and in fact, ultimately will, because we're going to have to get there to kind of get past the Midwit.
Werner Herzog calls it ecstatic truth, I think. Have you heard of that?
I haven't, no.
Yeah.
Honestly, I feel uncomfortable with that because the word ecstatic implies like irrational.
Yeah.
But this has nothing to do with irrational. In fact, all of logic is of that sort.
Yeah.
And all of mathematics is of that sort.
Yeah.
So, for example, I can say the phrase, Socrates is, all men are human. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is a duck.
Yeah. Yeah.
You will say, that's wrong, right? And again, we're all, and that's similar to the constraint associated with Aragorn, but also of a different sort, because there's something about it that has nothing to do with the notion that anybody in the world ever came up with the language, right? So Lord of the Rings has to do with the fact that a world was built, and that world has a reality and a continuity to it.
Right.
The syllogism that I just produced, obviously I'm violating a famous syllogism, but the syllogism has a reality to it that has nothing to do with who happens to say it or even the particular content, meaning logic is logic. And logic works in a certain way for a reason, which is that it participates in transcendent truth.
Yes.
One of the more powerful and experiential elements of transcendent truth is the experience of being or unity. And here I'm making a distinction between multiplicity and unity. So when you perceive, let's say, for example, again, the microphone in front of you as a microphone, as opposed to a blooming, buzzing confusion of quantum phenomena, something's happening there. And neither is more true from the point of view of empirical. Now, you could say, well, I'm making a pragmatic reducto. Well, I want to be able to use it for certain reasons. Yeah, true. But how? How is it that you're able to make this collapse of a multiplicity into a unity?
Right.
And by the way, when I do that, I'm also grasping a whole bunch of characteristics of it as a unity, which in the philosophical language are often called affordances. Well, that has to do with the faculties over here at the level of transcendent truth, which include things like insight and, by the way, faith. By the way, faith, asterisk, is another one of these things that have been terribly abused by the culture wars of the past 500 years.
Yes.
I've come to be able to notice that for for the most part, people who have drunk deeply of the Kool-Aid of largely the last century and a half have come to define the word faith to mean intentional self-deception or even intentional self-delusion.
Right.
That makes sense? Like, it's actually, when you really kind of tease, like, what do you mean when you say faith? You discover that that's what they mean. Like, I really, really, really know that X is not true, but I'm going to force myself to believe that X is true for reasons.
Which is in reaction to the mistake on the other side of faith being simply belief, when in reality it's much more closer to your second form of your second mode of truth, which is like the arrow that's true to its aim, right? It's kind of a faithfulness, right? A faithfulness to what it was. Faith in the biblical context often is rendered something like faithfulness or trust.
That's right.
Like a fidelity, like in marriage, which to me sounds like like you were talking about, the way things are designed and they're true to their design and form, right?
Got it. Well, let's get there in just a second. We're very close, so hold that. But come back to it, because that's going to be how we, I think, get out of this midwit eddy.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go back to the clip. So he makes the proposition that there's this characteristic, this part of the world, but not necessarily part of reality, called fictions, that, by the way, somehow Homo sapiens became capable of producing and interacting with these. And that they have power because, to the degree to which humans believe, although question mark, why do we believe them? And what does it mean to believe something? These fictions, then they can produce this new phenomenon in the world, which is coordination at scale. And in many ways, that's sort of the essence of his argument. I mean, he poses, for example, this notion of an island. And if you and a chimpanzee are alone on the island, the chimpanzee will thrive and probably kill you, and you won't do so well. But if you have 1,000 chimpanzees and 1,000 humans, the humans will outcompete the chimpanzees. Why? Because humans can coordinate at scale by means of stories. And we can all agree that there's a certain set of rules, which by hypothesis are made up by us. We have a faculty, belief. We have a faculty, the ability to communicate by means of language, that those two faculties allow us to produce agreements. We can then agree and then therefore communicate at scale in a way that chimpanzees can't. And that produces a power. Right? So that's all, by the way, true. There's no problem with that. But it's by no means the end of the story. So let's see. What makes a story more true than another story? So now we can go back to our modes of truth. Certainly, if the story is of the sort in the epistemological category of science and journalism, then it's more true the degree to which it more properly fits observations by some large N of separate observers. So intersubjective observation. Fair enough. Right? And we can actually have the difference between the Newtonian story and the Einsteinian story and say, okay, here's a variety of intersubjective observations. And it turns out the Einsteinian story does a better job of actually producing assertions that map to those intersubjective observations, and therefore it is more true. Excellent. However, not the whole of truth. So now we can talk about mode 2 truth, or lived truth. Now, what makes these stories more true? Well, obviously, these stories are more true the degree to which they further healthy, thriving, successful living. And so assertions around, for example, what makes a marriage strong? Well, a marriage is strong the degree to which the individuals involved are able to produce stories that actually are lived truth between them. Now, by the way, these lived truths will invariably have to have consilience with mode 1 truth. Now, we'll get to that in a moment, I suppose. But the basic point is delusion is delusion. We don't like delusion because delusion actually breaks our capacity to live.
Right.
So if my wife and I are both willfully deluded about some truth, and this unifies us in some strong way, the truth will out at some point. And we will come to some aspect of reality of the scientific journalistic sense. And we will find ourselves unable to navigate that reality properly because our commitment to a particular set of stories is leading us astray.
Yeah, live not by lies, in other words, right?
Yeah, live not by lies. Now, Why is that true? And what are all these wise sayings? Early to bed, early to rise. We call it, or tell the truth as an assertion. Is that true? Is that a true saying? That's a true statement? Is that a true thing? Well, why would it be? Well, because those kinds of assertions, when lived by, right, lived truth, when people live by these assertions, they guide their behavior and cultivate their character. This produces more thrivable, more generative human groups in the category of. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually very much throwing a hammer at the notion of intercultural relativism. There is definitely difference between cultures, and there have definitely been different arcs of the history of cultures, but they are not arbitrary. Right? That's the epistemological distinction. Right? To be purely relativistic is to say that the differences are effectively arbitrary. What I'm saying is that they're no more arbitrary than the fact that an elephant is not a whale. Elephants and whales are different, but they're not arbitrarily different. Whales are whales for very, very specific reasons having to do with the fact that they live in the water, and whales and elephants don't. And so the difference between cultures has to do with the context, the enabling and disabling constraints that the group of humans have had to face and navigate as they are developing their capacity to build a more and more enduring set of stories, set of behaviors, set of elements and characters and technologies that allows them to thrive in the world. Okay, so then let's bridge back to the last piece, the third truth. And this has to do with the fact that the transcendent is a mode. It's a part of reality. So we have this notion of the objective or the material, which has a certain number of elements. It tends to be able to be available to sense and available to intersubjective sense. We have the lived, which, by the way, is also experienceable by multiple people. When we're all living and living together, better or worse. And then we have this notion of the transcendent, of which math is the simplest version for the moment. There's lots of other stuff in the category of the transcendent. Maybe we're going to have to crack that open in a moment. But the category of math is simple. So math is immaterial. I cannot touch math. I cannot taste math. In some sense, I can't measure math by definition because I can't touch or taste or see it. Nonetheless, I can look at the fact that I have 2 hands and 2 feet and notice that the feetness and the handness is not the relevant characteristic. There's something about the two-ness that is A, real, and B, not bound to the material instantiation in any meaningful way. And of course, I can do that more broadly. I can look at 2 cockroaches. I can look at 2 notes in a song. Right? There's something about two-ness that has a reality that transcends their material instantiations. By the way, nothing that I'm saying is really very insightful. This is why it makes me so sad that it isn't obviously part of our basic cultural toolkit. Because it's important in terms of navigating reality properly. There's a lot of things that you can't do well and a lot of things that you'll do mistakenly if you don't really have a grasp of these things. They've been living in Western civilization for a long time. And by the way, not just Western, like basically every civilization have gone through this process many different times. So the transcendent, as you said, that notion of faith and faithfulness, the transcendent is the place, is the origin in the most fundamental level of the enabling and disabling constraints that we discover in reality, in lived experience. And then we, by the way, observe as the output of lived experience in the objective realm.
Yes.
So, and we again, the syllogism. The syllogism, I'll do it right this time. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That is a transcendent set of constraints. And we can say that is true. The category truth attaches to it because it navigates the set of constraints known as logic properly. And we have a faculty in ourselves that has the ability to perceive that set of constraints. Just by the way, the same way we have a faculty that's able to perceive whether we're swimming upstream or downstream. Notice that. I'm operating at a slightly higher level of abstraction. But I'm noticing that I take the abstraction of faculties of perception. I have a faculty of perception that affords me the ability to notice whether or not I'm feeling a hot rock with my hand, or that I'm swimming upstream or downstream, which is to say that I'm perceiving the state of enabling and disabling constraints. I'm perceiving the affordance of relationality of the environment that I'm in. I also have a faculty that allows me to perceive whether or not I'm engaging in a logical set of assertions. These are faculties that are available to me as and to navigate reality. And all 3 modes of truth are aspects of reality. Reality is, in fact, the union of these 3. take all three and you have them be unified in their own relationship. That's reality. Reality is not simply the objective. By the way, it's also not simply any of the others. Reality is all three. All right. So what I perceive to be the case, and I can't say this for sure because I've actually never been in a really nuanced dialogue with Harari, nor have I witnessed any out there. It's quite interesting, actually, when you take a look at his public persona and the way that he has shown up in recorded conversations. To be perfectly frank, it has the look and feel of a shtick, meaning he kind of says the same thing all the time. He has a series of things, certain jokes and things like that, and it just actually never. I haven't found, and by the way, I'm not neither significantly for or against this individual, so I have not investigated his identity deeply. But I have not found any particular interviews or conversations with him that have a feeling of like a deep dive.
But he's a pop culture avatar for a set of beliefs about the world. And that's what we're responding to.
And that's what we're responding to.
Yeah.
And so, and certainly we see this set of beliefs around the world commonplace. And again, most importantly, far too common, far too representative within the worldview of Davos man. And then we get
levers of power and industry and commerce and media and governance. That's the problem that we have here, I think.
So then let's get to maybe I would say as a good pause point, maybe even stopping point, which is from the point of view of mode 2 truth or lived truth, by the way. What's the trouble with the frame that Harari we're using him as an example of, and what might be the way of addressing it? All right. So the trouble, in particular, if we don't have access to the transcendent as a mode of truth, and really if we don't have access to the immanent or the lived as a mode of truth, which is to say that we perceive and relate to stories as just stories, as fictions, is how do we distinguish between them? How do we decide which stories we're going to actually use to guide our choices? And how do we decide when and how to modify our stories? What are the characteristics? Well, you kind of boil down to two. One is the degree to which they are alluring. They are compelling in, let's say, the propagandistic or the marketing sense. They are believed by a very large number of people. It's a very simple, what's this term? KPI, right? How many minds believe this story? And the second is the coordination power that they afford. Mm-hmm. Humans versus chimpanzees. And this to replace the chimpanzees and have two human groups for whatever reason incommensurable and therefore at significant odds. And you could say, well, the stories of Team A or the stories of Team B are going to be measured in truth by the degree to which they are able to allow Team A and Team B to compete with each other. If Team A's ideas produce a successful win and they extinguish Team B and dominate the island, they will say that their ideas are true.
Right.
Afforded a higher level of coordination capacity, power as an extended group. Well, fair enough. In some sense, that's not entirely wrong. We mentioned this in terms of lived truth. It allows us to thrive. And a piece of thriving is surviving. And a piece of surviving is outcompeting those who might, whose existence might make your survival no longer real. But if I move out and start looking at this thing over a longer scope of time and a longer scope of reality, what I begin to notice is that the topography of enabling and disabling constraints that make up reality in very profound ways, the law of gravity notwithstanding, we talked about that prior to the recording, govern the previous conversation completely. And so, for example, let's just take a look at the history of the West, which has a really interesting history in terms of conflict. And I don't mean colonialism and things like that. What I mean is that there's actually a number of stories where the West was able to have surprising asymmetric victories. Thermopylae is sort of the most notable, but it's only one of many, right? Many, many circumstances where the West somehow produced a capacity to have a small, underpowered group defeat a larger, overpowered group, surprising to the historical moment, to people at the time. And by the way, to both parties in the conflict.
Right.
Well, why? What was that? There's a really great book called Carnage and Culture, a series of books, but that's the central one, that goes through and digs into this. And the point is that there's innovations in the stories, let's say, or in some sense, even more fundamentally, in the ethos that emerged in the West that happens to produce groups that are able to compete very effectively in military combat. It has to do with things like peer-to-peer horizontal trust. And so the idea, for example, that the Greeks, even into the days of Alexander, all of the soldiers had choice and elected the generals. So before the battle, it was not a top-down imperial constraint. They were not conscripted and forced. They chose to be part of it. So there's a sense of agreement and voluntarism. Mm-hmm. Courage. I mean, we can take a look at the simplicity of the distinction between the ability of groups of people to coordinate into, let's say, a phalanx, just as an example, but just binding together and forming, having discipline. How successfully that outcompetes the kind of indigenous mode of warfare, which is irregulars, very loosely coordinated and diffuse. This is a technology that enables a higher degree of competition. Why? Because that's reality. Mm-hmm. The nature of reality is that the enabling and disabling constraints of conflict, military conflict between groups of individuals, is such that those who are able to produce the character of discipline and courage are able to form military formations that are able to outcompete those who don't have that character. Right? So here, I'm leaning very heavily on the transcendent, which is to say that we are collaboratively navigating the topography of the reality in which we live and discovering, in many cases, the hard way, the shape of it. And we're discovering what are the parameters and the shapes of what kinds of character, what kinds of behavior, what kinds of rules, what kinds of stories deliver truly successful, thriving, and living over long periods of time and over more and more diverse contexts. And that is the arc that we've been in. Right? This arc of history is not arbitrary, although it wanders. And it's not a straight line.
Right.
But it has an orienting basis to it, and it has a directionality. But which, by the way, the simple emergence of sapiens is a part of that directionality. And by the way, if we want to, we can double click on that particular, like what happened there? What happened in the point where Homo sapiens actually bridged from the rest of the hominid line, and how and why that kind of thing occurs? Well, the reason why it happens to occur is there's a tremendous affordance in the transcendent nature of reality to be able to tap into the ability to engage in pattern recognition and coordination at scale. Now, there's pattern recognition and coordination. Sorry, went off on a bit of a Jeremiah. I may have taken up a little bit too high, which will definitely annoy the Midwits, but maybe that's okay. The point I was trying to make there is that there's a category known as pattern recognition that is also part of the sapient toolkit. And it is more fundamental than communication for obvious reasons. Right? Just think about what's happening. For us to be able to communicate, I have to be able to recognize that there is some pattern in this fucking noise that is issuing out of your face. Right. It's not just random noise. There's a pattern to it. It's a very particular pattern to it. I can then convert that into meaning, which is called semantics. And then I have this faculty on my side for being able to do the same thing. I can, whatever we want to say is going on in my subjective and my interior, my psychological, my neurological interior, whatever we want to say about that. I definitely say this. It is not exactly the same in kind as the sounds that are coming out of my mouth. So there's some process of converting some kind of complex reality into some other kind of reality, which is, by the way, known as mediation, that has certain regular patterns that you then can perceive using your complex reality and the tympanic membrane and the neurological firing and all the other what it happens to be to produce a semantic communication between us.
Yes.
By the way, I'm really going off now. So now let me just kind of bridge over from, if you're operating within a metaphysics that doesn't have access to the transcendent, and we'll leave the immanent for the moment, you are actually limited to an interpretation of the thing that emerges in pattern recognition and communication as large-scale coordination. And I'm going to do something a little bit deep here. The point is I will both express, but also in some sense demonstrate. This is probably 2 levels higher in depth of thought than what I perceived in Harari's clip. All right, so let's see. We talked earlier about what happens when we have the ability to communicate, when we have the ability to produce stories, and we have the ability to believe the stories. Sorry, I have to laugh at the simplicity of that way of framing. But in any event, and I can afford large-scale coordination. I can get 1,000 human beings to coordinate, 1,000 chimpanzees can't. Okay. Now, what is this faculty of pattern recognition? What is this faculty of belief? Where is it grounded? What's going on? we would say something like mind, something like consciousness. By the way, a lot of hand waving goes on there. Like, what exactly is consciousness? What exactly is mind? And how does that fit into a world where it's not objective? That's a bit of a challenge. In any event, let's just take a look at the parameters of it. By axiomatic, consciousness is that which affords the possibility of pattern recognition and belief and understanding. So when I am communicating to you, I am conscious, I have a consciousness, and you have a consciousness, or mind. It doesn't. The point is, I'm just sort of defining that faculty, whatever that is. Now, coordination is where my consciousness and your consciousness are somehow able to interact with each other and perhaps align in some fashion. This is the 1,000 human beings coordinating into a fighting and thriving force vis-a-vis chimpanzees. But is that the fundamental nature of consciousness? For example, how might if we imagine, for example, that consciousness, at least to some extent, is related to neurons, why isn't it a coordination between and among distinct neurons? Well, we perceive consciousness as a whole that somehow is emergent from a multiplicity of neurons that are in communication. So would it not be the case, or at least plausibly the case, that when you and I are communicating, we are not coordinating our distinct consciousnesses, but are in fact engaging in a process of producing an emergent consciousness that is somehow transcendent to, or a whole between, that includes us, right? Much the same way that neurons do, by hypothesis. This is an example of the kind of thing that can happen when you actually have a much larger set of metaphysical tools to discuss the underlying phenomenon that are the subject of this particular clip. All right, so then the last. If you are ending up with a metaphysics that has things like belief is ultimately going to be grounded in things like convincingness or allurement, i.e. propaganda, entertainment, etc. And that coordination is ultimately, i.e. coordination, strength, power, is ultimately the primary way of measuring the degree to which a particular set of stories is effective, then that's a pretty straightforward ethos. There's not a lot of constraint on my ability to deploy power, to cultivate beliefs in the minds of other Homo sapiens for the purposes of more effectively coordinating larger and larger groups of people. In some sense, that's all that I could aspire to do. That's the best thing I could do. And if mine...
globalism, that's the animating force behind globalism, right?
Sure looks that way, right? This is the kind of point. It's like, I can't say for sure, although I've spoken with a number of individuals who are positions of influence and power in that world, and it kind of does seem to be that way. But you don't have a whole lot more in your toolkit to say otherwise. But if I notice that reality actually does include the immanent and the transcendent, and I notice that the transcendent provides us with, in fact, immaterial but real enabling and disabling constraints against which our lived experience and our coordination capacity must ultimately navigate, then would I discover that, in fact, there's a much deeper thing that's going on, that our stories ultimately are grappling with a topography of reality that is as distinct from our own preferences and wills as, let's say, the objective, even more so, and therefore shapes all the possible ways that we might actually be able to choose to go. Now, this has all kinds of profound implications. Now what we discover is that rights are something that we discovered, not something that we invented. Rights has to do with something that is intrinsic to the enabling and disabling constraints of transcendent reality, which is to say, go ahead.
That's largely what the founding fathers thought. A lot of them thought
that exactly as such, right?
Discovered.
Isn't it self-evident that these endowed by their creator, right? By the transcendent function of creation, endowed in the nature of the way that it produced reality, self-evidently generated certain characteristics. Now, obviously, the self-evidentness is a bit of a hand wave, but that happened a lot back in those days. That was a way of speaking.
Why did that become so quickly, seemingly demolished by this more Nietzschean will to power stuff that they're masquerading under victim concern at the globalist level, like what you're talking about? How did that become so quaint and devoured, so to speak. This notion of a creator within, endowing us with rights that were discovered by, self-evident, axiomatic,
Well, this
working
is
out, like what you're
real quick.
kind of
This is
doing. You're doing a high, you're doing a high level kind of analysis of something that these folks were
that they have.
working on when they constructed this country, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
So
lots
let's
of
say
flaws with it, of course. We're always going to say that as a disclaimer to keep our channel up on YouTube. But I'm just, but the point is that why did that become so? If it's, I mean, I guess that concept has lasted longer so far than this new globalist project. So maybe the globalist project will burn out faster. But it just seems like this will to power thing that really is underlying the assumptions that this gentleman's making.
no. I
I know
disagree.
I'm kind of making some shortcuts here, but just to kind of get to
Well,
the
yeah, you
to
never know. I may not disagree. Let's find out. So let me put a couple of things out there. So one, my immediate response to your question is something like growing pains.
right.
That's I think, and I have reasons for believing that more than just pure intuition. Two, if we want to actually do a detailed analysis of that, my friend John Vervaeke has, I think, like a 55 episode brilliant piece of work called Understanding the Meaning Crisis, maybe overcoming some adverb, the meaning crisis, which actually talks about this in some detail. It talks about a lot in some detail with this particular piece. Three, let's make clear that the point you're making is important, is that almost everything that I'm describing right now was conventional wisdom and well understood
Right.
for
Yeah.
15, 17, 1800 years in Western civilization, right? This is not even vaguely new.
Right.
We lost it, or we got confused, or whatever. We bullshitted ourselves in a very profound way. So the question is sort of why? What happened there? Part of it, by the way, is simply the implication of this mind-body distinction. And so by taking a mind-body distinction in a certain way, which, by the way, is itself based upon what's called the two worlds mythology, which is itself ultimately taken upon the scholastic bent in the West that subordinated, ultimately, but ever so subtly subordinated the transcendent to the journalistic scientific, way back, very, very early. So, by the way, there's a chain of events that occurred that build to this moment, and this is why ultimately we're on the path. And it's interesting because it's a bit of a, how would you say? It's a bit of a bargain because you do get power. If that's the trade you get, you do actually get material power, political power, military power in some sense.
Right.
Military power through technology, technological power for sure, by making this trade, right? By biasing, like for example, McGilchrist.
Yeah, Ian McGilchrist. We've had him on the show. Yeah.
Beautiful, right? Brilliant, and I think fundamental. And the basic sense is something like biasing towards, or in some sense actually centering the capacities of the left hemisphere. The analytic, the goal-directed, the strategic, even certain flavors of the semantic, the linguistic. And at a high level, that's a bit of a trade. It may be an error. I mean, it is an error, but it may not be known as a trade in the beginning. But what it does is it gives you the ability to have a felt sense of mastery and control and predictability and engineering facility over the subject that you're engaging with. Just like focused attention, for example, just as a simple piece. Certainly analytic, and certainly better coordination capacity. Notice that this keeps coming back. And that was a thing, right? It's a thing that occurred historically, particularly in the West, very early, talking before maybe around the first millennium in a big way. And then it built over time. And so we kept having these forks in the road where and by the way, not everybody, the Romantic movement was, for example, a late stage effort to react to this drift. But the drift ultimately has the advantage that in a context or milieu where certain kinds of behaviors, mostly oriented around strategic acumen, relatively easy to share explanations of reality, coordination capacity, and technological engineering, These tend to be upregulated by that set of choices. And so you start getting a civilization that is more and more based on that and more biased towards that. And by the way, that bias is double biased, meaning not only is it biased in terms of habit, but it's also biased in terms of proof. How do I know that X is true rather than Y? Well, X can do things like build rockets. Oh, yeah, building real material things that increase wealth or power is more important than, for example, cultivating healthy families that are able to sort of produce love and care for each other.
And the former priorities become the handmaiden for psychopaths. That's a big factor. I mean, people who really are really intent on using these things for coordinating and accumulating power. And I don't want to go down.
This goes back to the problem. Yeah. If you don't have deep grounding in the transcendent, you don't have deep grounding like wisdom, really understanding how to separate wisdom from intelligence,
right?
Deep grounding in that. If you don't have a grasp of faith as a fundamental faculty that you're beginning the process of cultivating as part of your basic nature and character, and not as just willfully imposed self-delusion, then you will be fertile ground for sociopaths and psychopaths. Both, right. That's a milieu, or it's just an environment or a landscape or an arena that they're very, very effective at playing in.
Yeah.
You can think about like the stories we have about vampires,
or
the stories that you might have around like these AI monsters. If you ever saw Ex Machina is fantastic. Right? She's a perfect example of the kind of thing that thrives in an environment that is grounded deeply in scientific journalistic truth, but not really meaningfully at all in lived and completely transcendent.
Yeah. Do you think that structural design of kind of like of deluding ourselves to forget the transcendent or delude ourselves into false alternatives to the transcendent, it seems like it has a kind of compounding interest effect that once you set that in motion, it kind of feeds in on itself, and it's kind of it's almost overwhelming. And a lot of folks feel like, my God, how do we unwind it? It's building and building and building. And yes, Jordan Hall and folks like him, they have these great, penetrating insights to kind of shine a light on what's happening, but it seems like the inertia is all moving in that direction, of kind of dysgenic, foolishness. Just put it in simple terms,
Well, yeah, what came up for me as you were describing that was actually very close to addiction.
Yeah.
And then equally, because I think it's actually the same at a very high level, whatever it's called, like debasement of currency, like money, inflation, or counterfeiting.
They're definitely debasing the cultural currency we have.
and the financial currency as rapidly as they can. And this is the point. So what happens is, I think we can do this just right. The problem with the transcendent is what it is. And I may not like what it is. I may like something different.
Yeah.
But we are very good at self-deception. That's where self-deception is in us. So let's say I want to do something. I want to engage in some behavior, which, by the way, I do daily, right? Daily. My wife made some challah bread recently. My wife and daughter, they're practicing baking. They decided challah bread, which is delicious, by the way. I should not be eating so much bread. Definitely not good for my body and metabolism. I know this is true from a transcendent perspective, the nature of reality. Very much not subject to my preferences. Not a good idea. Nonetheless, I do. How? I bullshit myself. I engage in self-deception in a variety of different ways. Right? I might distract myself so I don't even notice that I'm doing it. I might rationalize it in the very least amount. Because, of course, once I've eaten, it's too late. It's done. All right. And we do that, right? We do that like crazy. Right? We very much want to do X, and we'll find ways to navigate around the fact that X is not the right choice. I mean, come on. If you've ever had kids or ever been a human, the degree to which that's our nature is off the charts.
Yeah.
But now I've got some trouble because there's a bit of a reckoning that is built into that. If I splurge over Christmas, well, I'm going to have to exercise or diet, and it's going to be even more work to get back on track.
Right.
The nature, again, that's the nature of reality. Sorry, it is just what it is. We haven't got any choice in it. So there's a bit of a doubling down problem. if I allow myself to fully acknowledge the degree to which I have sort of stepped off the proper path, then I have to actually deal with the reckoning of what it takes to get back on the proper path. Not the least of which is I actually may have to break some old habits, lots of old habits. Well, that's trouble. And that's an addiction, right? Very straightforward. An addiction is when I make trade-offs for a short term. In some sense, it's the maximum addiction is the maximally brief, a very short-term win, or at least even sensation of a win, in exchange for I'm trading the actual complex, wholesome, long-term richness in exchange. And so we have lots of addictions. We have individual addictions, and we have cultural, social addictions. Inflation is an addiction. Power groups being in power in a fashion where they're not, in fact, engaging in stewardship, but power is an addiction. What do I mean by that? What I mean is every society where the elite separate themselves from proper stewardship of the health and vitality of the society by perceiving truth properly and then navigating their choices on the basis of that truth, kills the society that they're part of, and therefore undermines the thing that enables them to be wealthy and powerful in the first place. It is a self-extinguishing strategy, but addictions happen all the time. So I would say that basic dynamic of addiction, which is this very particular dynamic of self-deception, trading a very short-term, small, but perhaps highly salient, salient meaning I can really sense it. It has a lot of immediate, instantaneous signaling of good.
Like a casino,
or heroin, the same, or my cell phone. In a trade against a more subtle, more wholesome, and by wholesome I mean both in the sense of it deals with a much larger whole, and it deals with a deeper health, and by the way, with more holiness, and longer term, and by the way, in some cases larger in scope. I mean, a simple example is like the one of I'll make the trade-off by defecting against you, like the prisoner's dilemma. I'll get X points for myself by defecting against you. But by virtue of defecting against you, what I do is I ultimately betray you and break apart us as a larger whole, and therefore remove all possibility of what would have required two people to cooperate in all future states. And so I've actually screwed myself by virtue of making a short-term trade-off. And so that kind of dynamic, which is a variation of what's called the Moloch problem, is deeply, deeply characteristic of the human challenge, the challenge of being humans in the world. Maybe all beings, but certainly humans. And I think is highly explanatory of how we found ourselves in this particular circumstance.
Yeah.
There's a lot of addiction, a lot of self-deception, a lot of willful self-deception.
Right.
Where I'm able to get away with behaviors that I want to be able to get away with.
Right.
That if I more fully and completely perceived a large reality, particularly the transcendent, I would have to actually have a reckoning and then go through the painful, and by the way, maybe even multi-generational process of ameliorating and addressing. Right. That's a decent chunk of it. Maybe not all of it, but certainly a decent chunk of it.
It seems like, the wisdom of the ages before us had constrained some of that heroin tendency in human desire and human culture. And as long as it was kept to the margins, we could function and it could move in a direction that seemed to be somewhat positive for human flourishing. But now it seems like the cat's out of the bag, and the vast majority of the culture is so caught up in that heroin that the question I have is, how does heaven compete with that heroin? How does heaven compete with the shortcut to heaven that leads to this hell on earth that is heroin? Once you get people pressing the button over and over and over again, like if you could keep a society where that behavior set of heroin is marginalized to such a small degree, it doesn't contaminate the whole, as you got to work on it, mitigate it, try to deal with people. But once it hits a certain critical mass of society, like I said, that compounding interest effect of like, how do you get out of that hole once you're in there? How can heaven, which says diet or whatever, withdrawal, hangover, horrible, things, how does heaven compete with that short-term false heaven that is the heroin addiction of our society?
Yeah, it's funny. I got a little bit confused by the way you were describing it, because sort of the essential nature of heaven is heaven doesn't compete in that sense. But let me say it in a different way, and you tell me if I'm understanding what you mean. It's how do we repent and sin no more?
Right.
How do we humans shake the monkey on our back and begin the process of heading back towards reality? I mean, in some sense, simple as that. Yeah. Well, historically and typically, like in the literature, both of addiction recovery and in the literature of civilizations rise and fall, we hit rock bottom. And when you finally cannot but look squarely in the eyes of the reality that there is no future for this set of behaviors and this set of choices.
Yeah.
That's called a crisis. Right? The word crisis means the end of something because it cannot any longer maintain. And to be in a crisis is to be in a circumstance where something is straight up going to come to an end, not because it wants to, but because there is no other possibility. So typically, crisis. All right. And by the way, this very Old Testament, when you take a look at the arc of the Old Testament, so much of the Old Testament is basically this story. Oh, Israel, you lost the plot yet again. Right? You're worshiping golden calves. You're engaging in all kinds of terrible behavior, and as you well know, that means you're going to just be utterly ruined. And the bad guys are going to come in and take all your stuff, and you're going to be in trouble. And that's the wages of this thing. And I keep telling you that. Keep sending prophets. The prophets tell you what is effectively the same story every time. And that's how it happens. And by the way, that's the story. It's certainly the story, let's say, of the Bronze Age collapse, the story of the Roman collapse, and the story of effectively every addict who's hit rock bottom. So the real question, I would say, is how do we become sensitive enough to that reality that we can have a proper crisis, a truly clarifying crisis, truly have a moment of clarity that does not require us to have become so utterly destroyed that there is no possibility of recovery.
Yeah.
That's I think is the question that we're really ultimately facing. And that's why we're having this conversation. Right? In some sense, the conversation is, this thing is running amok and we really need to address it. Is there a way for us to actually just address it without having to die or face death existentially before we're able to turn around? Can we truly repent?
Because history shows that when people get to that death point, oftentimes they cling to the next heroine of another revolution, or look at this, look at what happened to the Bolshevik Revolution. Like, how long? I don't want to go through that. I mean, we could go there for decades and decades of misery and
not
lies.
Really. Fortunately, in some sense, practically speaking, the magnitude of power that we're dealing with, we will not be going through anything for decades and decades if it ends up kind of going off the cliff, which we don't mind. So actually, let me make that point a little bit more clearly. So let's just take the Bronze Age collapse, because it's a beautiful example. Long time ago, 3,000 years ago. More than that, 4,000 years, I suppose. Bad. A whole bunch, effectively all the civilizations outside of China and India just collapsed, many of which were erased from history. They were so completely collapsed, we didn't even know they existed at all until very recently. So that's a serious collapse. And they had been around for a long time. We're talking about 1,000-year civilizations that just totally hit rock bottom all at once, very quickly, by the way. Well, what happens is that actually was existential. Like, the Hittites are just straight up gone. There are no more Hittites. But fortunately, that was actually, at the end of the day, a relatively small portion of the human population, a relatively small portion of the world. And they only had swords, bronze swords, and fire. Famine can only spread so far when only a small portion of the world is taken care of. We're dealing with the whole world. Everybody. China's part of it. India's part of it. New Guinea's part of it. We're dealing with not just nukes. We're dealing with adding more and more destructive power to our portfolio every day in a wide variety of different ways. Biologics, most notably, most recently, but continuing. So there's nowhere to go. There's no reservoir of more people or more land that is obviously going to be untouched. And the magnitude of the touch is very high. And so if and as this thing begins to unravel, if the wages of sin begin to fall upon us, and we begin to balkanize into variations on the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Civil War, fill in the blank, again, the Bronze Age collapse, the end result is rather like not, it's existential. And it's the kind of thing, it is actually the kind of thing that we talked about during the 80s with nuclear exchange. I mean, think about it. The probability of nuclear exchange in the Ukraine, which is trivial in scope, is kind of the highest we've been at since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's just, again, trivial in the larger scheme of things. So it goes to something like wisdom, and it goes to something like grace, as far as I can tell. Yeah. So can we actually find ways as individuals and groups to be navigated by wisdom, which means really grasping the transcendent and the immanent, so part of a larger whole.
Yeah.
And is it in fact the case? And can we participate in the grace that extends from the transcendent, that is the thing that enables us to be much more than we are?
So Klaus Schwab watches this video and he says, I want to speak to you, Jordan. And so you come into his next meeting, and it's not a big present. He's not going to give you the Malay speech. You're not going to get that. But he says, I want to talk to you one-on-one. What are you trying to get at here? I mean, just a thought experiment. What would you tell someone like that?
Well, the thing I think is really to land something in that moment of lived truth. The most important thing is humility, because humility opens you to actually perceive. Humility, right? If we can find some way of bringing someone like Klaus to have a felt sense, to experience, to be is the right way of describing it, to be humbled, to have a feeling of humility before something that is much, much larger than himself, much, much larger than his intellect and his ability to understand. And I don't mean that somebody else is smarter. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that there's a proper relationship between intellect and wisdom. There's a proper relationship between intellect, wisdom, and faith, which grounds faith as the more fundamental.
Yeah. And
that feeling, right? If we can actually have that feeling, we can become open. Right? Something lands on his heart. A truth lands on his heart. It is more profound than any truth that he has had with his mind. And it's unshakable as a consequence. And it just, wow, that is, I cannot help but acknowledge the truth of that in a way that transcends my ability to think and understand and justify. But it is more fundamental than anything that has landed in my mind. That would be the correct answer. Right. And of course, that then depends upon something much more significant than me. Right? My only hope would be able to be a proper vehicle for that truth to land in his heart.
Yeah. I'm excited to see what we can do, because I think it's interesting to consider, everybody who is disappointed with the way the culture and things seem to be trending for the short term, at least. We're always talking about technology solutions or parallel economies and all this other stuff. And I hardly ever see anybody say, what if we could have a Saul to Paul conversion for people like the Schwabs of the world? He's a figure, but those folks, because that's the story. That's the meaning of that story. That sometimes, Saul was kind of a sociopathic a zealot. He wanted to kill people. His idea of transcendence and protecting the transcendence that he had in mind was to kill people, and he had to encounter humility and truth, right, to expose what he was doing as frivolous and as not real, and so then so his view of transcendence had to be shattered. That's not God. You're not killing in the name of God. You're actually killing God by trying to kill in the name of God, and now God shows up in your story, and and that orients his perspective in a different direction. So
yeah,
I wonder, and I hope that we can have a few Hail Mary opportunities that maybe somehow some of these folks and these power levers can start to say, man, not that we need those saviors, but just rather, I think that would be a beautiful thing, just to say, hey,
well, here's
I have the means to do something, and I've been doing it the wrong way, and I want to do it the right way, and truly do it the right way, not just,
Here's something that occurs to me that gives a sense of hope or possibility in that direction. And remember, we're definitely not talking about convincing. Right? This has nothing to do with convincing.
Right.
I can provide the intellectual argument and background for all the things that I'm saying in a fashion that I believe is simply utterly defensible and dismantles other forms of intellectual construct. But that doesn't change the effect people's beliefs at all, really. It usually just makes them mad. What came to my mind when you were talking about Saul to Paul is I actually was thinking about the woman at the well.
Yeah.
And then what I realized is that the good news in this sense is that you think about the notion of wholeness in yourself or integrity, to be fully whole in yourself, not divided against yourself.
Yeah.
Part of you is connected to the transcendent. Part of you is transcendent. So simply to become that part of you is always going to be pulling. So there's something within everyone that is pulling in that direction, no matter how far away they've gotten. And if we can find ways to cultivate in people a willingness to listen to that and then to hear it, which are different things, which is what happened to me. So I know it can happen first person. Then the thing that you're talking about will happen, actually. Not can, but will.
Did you have an immediate road to Tarsus, or you mean a
No. I had a very, very long and very arduous journey of more and more becoming more and more capable of and more willing to undergo a process of listening to the whole of myself and then becoming capable of hearing a larger and larger piece of the wholeness, of the holiness that I happen to be part of.
Yeah.
Which, of course, both involved and produced a tremendous amount of humility.
Yeah. I keep thinking the whole time, such is the king of these, the idea of like, there's something beautiful that needs to be fully understood more deeply. This idea of like when Jesus points at the children and says, this is the way of the kingdom of heaven. And we always, the immediate cultural memory of that story kind of hallmark cards that as, isn't that sweet? He's just saying, look how sweet and cuddly the kids are. That's what we need to be like. But there's something else there, that's very powerful. The wisdom that confounds the wise. And there children. And one of the things that I think Jesus is talking about is this kind of children, they don't fear things that adults fear, and they have a deep self-assured confidence that's kind of related to that lived truth thing that you were talking about.
Yeah.
That's they're kind of in the flow state of where, you know what I mean? Like they don't. You tell a little toddler, someone that they knew and loved dies, they are sad, but they don't let it weigh down on them. They just kind of, okay, well, they'll be back one day. We'll see them flying around one day. It's kind of like, all right, that's sad, but okay, let's go. That kind of, there's a courage and a confidence that I think Jesus is kind of picturing there, maybe part of the idea he has in his story,
Yeah, what was coming to, so I'm thinking about the process of why, like what's happening there.
Yeah.
What adults fear. Certainly a big part of that process has to do with the development of what many people might call the ego mind, or ego identity, or just identity.
Yeah.
And, it might be helpful, I suppose, to share with those who are trapped in that that's a trap. That maturity, literally the old-fashioned process of becoming a grown-up, is actually the process of liberating yourself from the constraints of the ego identity that you constructed during your late childhood and adolescence to be able to navigate the social environment and suffer the slings and arrows of all the other people who are developing their own sharp, pointy sticks of social command and control. So that's important. If you look at the feeling, like I was really diagnosing, what is this thing midwit that I'm like going on there? It's not a cute thing. I mean, the meme is fine. The meme is a symbol and it helps us. But you could, in principle, have an IQ of 160 and be a midwit. Right? You could have a very high level of kind of complexity. You could think in a very sophisticated way and still be a midwit. What is that? What I would say is that it's most fundamentally grounded in an adolescent lack of full fundamental maturity.
Right.
You're still ultimately running an identity structure, a persona. And your intellect is now driving this persona, but it's in between you, yourself, your heart, and other people and the world. And that's a terrible thing. Right? So many people, I would say the vast majority of Westerners actually still live that way. Right? We don't have any grown-ups. We have very clever adolescents, and we have very old adolescents, and sometimes both old and clever. But that's actually hell on earth, because you really can't be loved or feel love. You can't be seen. You can't be met. All the things your heart truly yearns for, you yourself are preventing yourself from getting access to that.
Yeah.
So the invitation of this notion of repent is actually the invitation of put down something that is actually the prison that you created for yourself, that no longer serves you in any way.
Right.
It actually separates you from all the things that you yearn for and that are meaningful at all. Now, you're literally living a life of completely separated from meaningfulness and from relationship, true, deep relationship with other people, with yourself, and with God for sure. So put that down. And just
don't take yourself so serious.
Step through that. Exactly. That, of course, humility is the salve. Like, it's the thing that allows you to begin to step out of that.
Right.
And addiction is the thing that prevents you from being able to step out of that. So these things are all very neatly tied together.
It's a beautiful thing. Kids don't hold grudges when they're young enough. They don't hold grudges. They don't hold resentments, long-lasting resentments. They don't let anger, they don't let the sun go down on their wrath. There's a lot of those biblical principles that they are a picture that we can emulate. And it is interesting, paradoxically, how, like what you're saying, the problem of eternal adolescence is solved by Jesus's picture of the kingdom of heaven looking like little kids. It's interesting how that
very profound
that frees you, right? Kind of that frees you from that perpetual try hard assertion of oneself, right? And one's ego, right? Hey, I really appreciate your time, Jordan. It's always great to hear from you, and you're always a refreshing person to learn from. So I do thank you for your time, and I think you did a good job of responding to kind of the general problem of kind of what Harari and folks like him are stuck in. So hopefully that will bear fruit in some way. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, thanks for engaging me in this conversation, this moment. I hope it's helpful.
Thank you. Take care.